Thank you. Wow, this is a hell of a big crowd. It's quite unbelievable. It's exciting, and my name is Peter Neufeld, and I am thrilled to be here this afternoon to introduce our keynote speaker, Valerie Jarrett. And as you all know, not just from the program, but from seeing her in the media over the last 8 years, Valerie served as the senior advisor to President Obama. And during her tenure at the White House, she fought hard and successfully to improve criminal justice. From her strategic office in the West Wing, she became a great spokesperson about the forces and factors that lead to mass incarceration. She highlighted the disgusting effects of solitary confinement, and she talked about new ways to accomplish re-entry in a much more civilized society. In terms of our innocence work, she was simply our staunchest ally in the executive branch, barring none. I'm not going to tell you all the stories, but her ability to convince the uninformed and even the recalcitrant that the misapplication of forensic science has unconscionable consequences for the wrongfully convicted, for the innocent. As you all know, it's 50% of the DNA cases, it's 500 of the 2,000 exonerations, where the misapplication of forensic science was one of the contributing factors to those wrongful convictions. We have been a fortunate group to connect with Valerie Jarrett over these years. We have gone to a number of meetings in her office in the West Wing. And quite honestly, I and my colleagues were somewhat starstruck sitting there in the West Wing, a few feet from the Oval Office, with all that was going on in the world. But to her credit, she was never formal, and she never had any kind of pretense. I can't say the same for us at times, but she tried to show us the way. Valerie played the most critical role in the administration, not just at the White House on our innocence agenda, but also at the Department of Justice, at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and throughout the executive branch. And when we talk about in our work being at the cross-section of science and law, Valerie is actually the embodiment, as I just learned, because her father was a world-class molecular biologist and the first African-American tenured in the biological sciences at the University of Chicago. Her mother was also an intellectual and academic leader. But at the other side of that intersection is her daughter. And her daughter was a kick-ass litigator out of Northwestern, who now is both a journalist focusing on legal stories. So I hope you enjoy being at that cross-section, Valerie. I look around the room and I see that we have representatives from 70 different innocence organizations from around the world. We've never had that before. But all of you know from your work that when you think about forensic science, the most important word is science, and the best science. And that's something that Valerie Jarrett's work has stood for during these years that we've worked together. And I see almost 200 exonerees in this room. And there is absolutely no question, and we all know it, that it's your stories that are the most effective generators of policy reform in this country. And I believe that Valerie Jarrett is one person in policy who has been deeply affected by your stories, as well as by the unique life experience that she has had. Together, those stories and her life experience make her one of the great champions of justice. Please welcome Valerie Jarrett.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. I said to Peter, please come with me everywhere. Do all my introductions. Good afternoon, everyone. Peter, I want to say to you that your vision, your leadership, your grit, your determination were key to catalyze this incredible network. My goodness, look at the size of this room. Happy 16th gathering that you're having here today. The network that has helped exonerate thousands of people who were unjustly stripped from their families, their communities, their jobs, their livelihood, and who were left to languish in our prisons. Those exonerations have reunited families who have been denied the precious time together. Missing birthdays, graduations, marriages, holidays, anniversaries, careers, deaths of loved ones, but also the simplest of pleasures. Living in the privacy of your own home, meals with friends and family, a child's first step or first word, a stroll in the park, the normal daily laughter and tears of life, the seemingly mundane routine that those of us who are free take for granted. But we know that the often irreparable damage that is done by those wrongful convictions does not go away. And that is why it's also so important, Peter, that you have spearheaded, together with so many of you around this room, the changes to harmful public policies, and that those critical reforms are today benefiting millions of Americans. So how about one more shout out for all of you? So Peter mentioned that in our midst there are approximately 200 exonerees and their families. And so I want to begin by acknowledging you. So would you please stand so that we could recognize you? Thank you. Thank you for being with us today. My firsthand introduction to the Innocence Network was in the summer of 2005. My daughter Laura was just finishing her sophomore year of college, and during the summer she interned at Northwestern University's Wrongful Conviction Center. She collected data on false confessions during police interrogations, as well as cases of exculpatory DNA evidence and police misconduct that ultimately led to exonerations. That experience ignited in Laura a passion for the law. It shaped her critical thinking about the fundamental flaws of our criminal justice system, and very importantly, it gave her an unwavering empathy for generations of individuals and their families who have been wrongfully swept up in the criminal justice system's vortex. Inhumane vortex, I might add. She came home more days than not with tears welling, and she shared with me the excruciating stories about people, usually poor and Black or Hispanic, who had received nothing close to the fair shake that a just system should mandate. She learned about incentivized informants, inadequate defenses, unscientific forensics, prosecutorial abuse and misconduct, false confessions, eyewitness misidentifications, and much, much more. By the end of the summer, she was left with an indelible appreciation for the unique and vital role that people who dedicate their careers in service to the public play in our society. In Laura's college dissertation, she focused on false confessions during police interrogations. She then went on to law school, as you heard. She clerked for both a federal district court judge and the Seventh Circuit in Illinois, and practiced law for 6 years. And just recently, she joined CNN and is covering the Justice Beat. A lot to cover, I would add. I share this with you not to brag about Laura, although what parent doesn't brag about their child, right? Any good parent does. But because I want to begin my remarks today by publicly saying thank you for contributing in such a profound way to both the professional and, importantly, the character development of my daughter. So to the 400 lawyers, as well as the staff and volunteers from the nearly 69 organizations here today from around our country and around the world, I want to thank you for your countless hours that you have spent in service of a higher calling. You're role models for young people like my daughter across the world. They look up to you, and they need you in order to grow up prepared to fulfill what I believe is their civic responsibility to perfect our union. Now, we know that there are supposed to be checks and balances throughout the criminal justice system, that they are designed to prevent wrongful convictions from happening in the first place. The way our system was conceived, police gather reliable, scientifically sound evidence before they arrest a defendant. Prosecutors evaluate the evidence gathered, only bringing charges when they believe that they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt and fully disclose all evidence, including exculpatory evidence, to the other side. The defense counsel zealously represent their clients, including having access to experts and tests to challenge evidence and time to investigate a case and hold the state to the burden of proof. So what could go wrong? Well, as we know in practice over a long history, for far, far too many, that plenty can and has gone wrong. So that's why President Obama and all of those of us who had the privilege of serving for 8 years in his administration were so proud to work with you as we tried, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., to bend that long arc of the moral universe towards justice. Today, we have made significant progress. In 2010, under Attorney General Eric Holder, the Department of Justice issued new rules to provide criminal defendants with comprehensive pretrial evidence, creating a policy of turning over more evidence than the law requires. In May of 2014, DOJ announced that its federal agents would be required to videotape interrogations of detained individuals in order to ensure suspects' civil rights are respected during the interview process. In September of 2014, a new department-wide policy was put in place that directed federal prosecutors to no longer require, as a part of the plea agreement, that the defendants waive their right to appeal based on ineffective assistance to counsel. Also in September of 2014, the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia created the first ever conviction integrity unit in the wake of serious issues involving forensic evidence processed by the FBI crime labs. And state and local jurisdictions across our country have led the way in standing up these conviction integrity units with real results. And Barry and I were just talking about two of the strongest units are in Brooklyn and Dallas DAs, and they serve as a model for the rest of the country because they are responsible for 25 exonerations since 2008 alone. If they can do that, just imagine what everybody else can do. And as Peter mentioned, I am particularly proud of the work that we've done, transformative, I would say, to strengthen the field of forensic medicine. Misapplications of forensic science are the second most common contributing factor to wrongful convictions, found in 46% of DNA cases alone. And with your help and guidance, the Obama administration took multiple steps to begin to tackle the challenges of forensic science, including most recently the invaluable work done by the President's Advisory and Science Technology Advisory Group, PCAST as we call it, that did extensive research and analysis and came back with clear guidelines for how, working through NIST and the FBI, we need to ensure that forensic medicine is actually evidence-based in science. So the work that we have done together is extraordinarily important. It makes our system fairer. And in my time remaining, I want to summarize how the work that you all do fits into the broader context of the President's vision, President Obama. I now have to say President Obama. Just to be clear, how it fits into President Obama's overall vision for the reforms that our criminal justice system need. So first, some facts. In the United States, we have 5% of the world's population, yet 25% of the world's prisoners. We spend $80 billion, that's a B, dollar every year on our criminal justice system. Between 1990 and 2014, the prison population grew by 61%. The number of women who were incarcerated has increased by 400% in the last 30 years. We have 2.2 million people in our prisons. That is unsustainable. So the challenge I see is threefold. How do we keep people out of the system? How do we make the system fairer? And how do we break the cycle of recidivism? If we address these three challenges, not only will the system be fairer, but I believe our country will be safer. So first, how do we keep people out of the system in the first place? I'll begin with a story. There was a young man who I worked with in the White House who worked in the Chief of Staff's office. His name was Mo Owens. I hope he's watching online. So Mo grew up in poverty, single mom, watched his colleagues, youngsters, growing with whom he grew up, classmates, literally murdered on the streets in front of his very eyes, traumatized by their circumstances. And so I said to Mo one day, Mo, how did you get here? What are you doing in the White House working for the Chief of Staff? And he said two things, which I'll never forget. He said, first of all, I had a mom who loved me. And she told me that children rise to the expectations that the adults that they love set for them. Point number one. Second point he made is that she was able to get a safety net of support and a mentor to help her raise him, who opened up doors for him, because we know talent is ubiquitous, but opportunity is not. And so Mo described to me what I would want for every child, which is that fair shot, which is why we have to begin before they're born, as Peter and I were just talking. We need to make sure every child gets a quality early childhood education, regardless of their income. We need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to break that sexual assault to prison pipeline that happens too often, particularly to girls of color in our communities. I pause on this point because on September 2nd of 2015, I had a day that I'll never forget. I visited Compton, California, not far from here, and I visited a court called the Star Court. And a judge there, Judge Pratt, had noticed that with all of the young juveniles, and it was a juvenile court, that all of the young juvenile girls, regardless of the crime they committed, had one thing in common. Every single one of them had been a victim of commercial sexual exploitation. And so her goal was to figure out, how can I keep them from being incarcerated? Let me get to the root cause that led them to commit a crime in the first place. And so I met with a group of girls and I visited a detention center, and one of them said to me, at the age of 1, both of my parents began sexually abusing me. both of my parents. And so as soon as I could, at the age of 8, I ran away. But on the streets of Compton, you get about 2 blocks if you are a girl without a pimp picking you up. In fact, there was online a book called How to Become a Pimp. These girls were often tattooed. And then I visited Homeboy Cafe that same day. And in addition to helping people get jobs, they have a tattoo removal service. If you can imagine what that means to the psychology of someone who has been branded like an animal, to have that tattoo removed. So we have to break that sexual abuse to prison pipeline. We also have to break the school to prison pipeline. Far too many of our young boys, particularly young boys of color, are being suspended and expelled from school. Now, it's not always the teacher's fault. They have large classrooms, and children are coming to school hungry, sleepy, angry, having experienced trauma at home, with all sorts of absolutely understandable behavioral challenges. And so we need the teachers to have a safety net around them so that we can keep the children in the schools. We should not turn them out on the streets and then be surprised if they get caught up in the criminal justice system. We must break that. And so the good news there is that for the girls, we have a consortium of foundations that are dedicated to analyzing and researching the unique challenges that girls of color face to help break that cycle. And for the boys, we have My Brother's Keeper that President Obama launched a few years ago in the wake of the death of Trayvon Martin and the verdict in the Zimmerman trial. And he said we must all ask ourselves what we can do to create a society where our boys and young men of color are not considered a threat just simply by walking down the street, but that we create that even playing field where they can accomplish their dreams just like everybody else. Second, how do we make the system fairer? Well, we began early in the administration by passing the fair sentencing legislation, which helped even out a little bit the discrepancy between crack and powder cocaine. It could be closed even further, but it was a step in the right direction. And in the wake of the Michael Brown death, several other highly publicized deaths at the hands of law enforcement across the country, President Obama created the 21st Century Task Force on Policing. We have over 18,000 police districts around our country, and many of them do not have the resources to adequately train. They don't have the body armor or any of the facilities that you need in order to ensure that police who go out to serve and protect, who deserve to come home too, are equipped for the challenges. And so the goal was to create this bond of trust between police and the communities of color that they serve. And we've made a great deal of progress on a whole range of fronts, and one of them I would mention to you is our Police Data Initiative. One of the big challenges is just honesty and trust, and so transparency is the best way to accomplish that. And our Police Data Initiative is working with 31 police departments covering over 34 million Americans already to share data and be able to analyze exactly what's happening in communities. We also have a data-driven justice initiative that tackles the challenges of people with mental illnesses who are all too often cycled repeatedly through our nation's 3,100 jails. We have, in any given year, 11 million people in our jails. They stay an average of 23 days, yet only 5% are ultimately convicted and sentenced to time. What's wrong with that? How can we break that cycle? And are those folks people who actually belong in jail in the first place? According to the University of Michigan National Register of Exonerations, more than 2,000 people have been exonerated for crimes that they didn't commit. Hope that number is correct. And the actual number of people who are wrongfully convicted, of course, we know is much higher. And in many cases, people who have been exonerated actually confessed or pled guilty to crimes they didn't commit. Now, when I first heard that, I thought, well, why would you plead guilty to a crime you didn't commit? And then I went with the President, Obama, when he visited El Reno, when he went to visit the El Reno Penitentiary in Oklahoma, first sitting president to visit a federal penitentiary. And I listened as he sat around the table with a group of young men, and he asked them how many of them pled. Every hand went up. And then he started talking to them about the circumstances. And one guy said, yeah, I pled to a crime that was committed while I was in here. Yeah, exactly. So President Obama said, well, why on earth would you do that? He said, well, my lawyer told me they had 2 eyewitnesses. Right, what? But the president said, but you were here. You got the best alibi in the world. And so I share that with you to say how much faith had that young man lost in our system that he thought he had no recourse other than to plead guilty to a crime that was committed while he was incarcerated. The research shows that youth and people with mental illnesses or intellectual disabilities are particularly vulnerable to police interrogations and are often more likely to falsely confess. Exonerations are the ultimate evidence, in my opinion, of the failure of our criminal justice system, because we should take the lesson and learn from them to drive comprehensive reform. Our data-driven justice initiative has grown to a bipartisan coalition of over 141 cities and counties and state governments covering more than 94 million Americans and counting. And it is currently housed at the Laura and John Arnold Foundation so that we know that that important work will continue, although obviously the president is no longer in office. Another important area are fees, bail, and bond. Due to increased concern about expanded monetary penalties which disproportionately obviously affect the poor, President Obama asked his Council on Economic Advisors to look at it. And it showed what we all know, which is that if you are poor, how are you going to pay your fee? How are you going to pay your bond? Those 23 days that people are spending, the 11 million people in our jails, disproportionately are poor because they can't afford the bond. And the fact that only 5% of them ultimately are convicted and serve more time means that they were not a threat to society if 23 days was enough. So what are we going to do to ensure that we have a system that is fairer? And so one of the steps that we took was to ensure that through the Justice Department that we were aggressively looking at cities that had patterns and practices of behavior such as this. And the city of Ferguson, Missouri, that we're all so acutely aware of, turned out, as a result of citizens there marching and demonstrating and bringing to the attention of the Justice Department what was happening in Ferguson, the Justice Department found a pattern and practice of discriminatory behavior and brought enforcement action and reached a settlement with Ferguson. And that needs to continue all around our country. Another very important point that Peter alluded to is solitary confinement. The President directed his Department of Justice to do an analysis of solitary confinement to determine whether or not it actually is working. And what they concluded under Loretta Lynch is that not only is it not an effective tool, but that particularly for young people, it has long-term traumatic effects. And so under President Obama's direction, the Justice Department has ended solitary confinement completely for juveniles and scaled it back dramatically for everybody else. The other area where we got close, but we did not succeed, was getting federal legislation to reduce mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent drug offenders. We all know that the existing laws are arbitrary and capricious. And in fact, President Obama received a letter from a federal judge, who will remain nameless, who said, and I just about quote, "Every time I look at the list of people who you are pardoning, I check to see if one man is on that list. It's a man who I sentenced to prison 20 years ago. And I knew at the time that he did not deserve the mandatory minimum sentence that I was obligated to give him. And he has haunted me every day. And a few days ago, I looked at the list and he was on it." Well, you shouldn't have to rely on a presidential pardon in order to get justice. We should make it a part of the law to begin with. It has to be a part of the law. And I'll get back to that in a minute. So lastly, how do we break the cycle of recidivism? President Obama created a re-entry task force, an all-government task force made up of people from every agency in the federal government to focus holistically on what could we do to ensure the people who were released were ready to hit the ground running. So we focused on substance abuse through the Department of Health and Human Services, and psychiatric care also through the same department, education and training through the Department of Education and the Department of Labor. And I can give you one example that is being mirrored at the state level. A few months ago, I have no such sense of time anymore because it probably feels like 5 years ago, but last September, I visited San Quentin Penitentiary, state penitentiary here in the Bay Area. And I visited a class where they were teaching the inmates how to code. Now, I don't know how to code. I don't know how many of you know how to code, but those guys know how to code now, and they are working with employers who are offering them jobs when they are released. So they're developing the skill while they're in prison that allows them to provide for their families and be law-abiding adults when they leave. We need to mirror those kind of programs all across the country. Another good example is I went with the president to visit a reentry program in Newark, and we met a young man who I won't forget either, who was in prison for about 10 years. A lot happened in that 10-year period, like the internet. And so when he came out, he didn't know how to use the internet. And he was given a bus ticket back to a community that was no longer home. His family, his parents had died, he had no relatives there. The only people still in that community were like Cousin Pookie on the corner who got him in trouble in the first place, right? And so he's crashing on a friend's couch, working at McDonald's, trying to make ends meet. What does he want to do? He wants to be an EMT. And so a probation officer and a federal judge appointed by President Obama cobbled together resources to help put him through the training program. And now he is traveling the streets, helping the people of Newark, leading a law-abiding life. Which of course gets us to the heart of jobs. And so President Obama led by example by signing an executive order that bans the box for federal contractors. Very important first step. But that only gets us so far. He also has been supporting legislation at the federal level to ensure that we don't take a look at the front end of the application and decide we're not going to hire somebody, give them a chance to sell themselves to you first before you make those kind of decisions. But knowing that the members of Congress weren't going to pass legislation, the president also asked the private sector to sign what we called a Fair Chance Business Pledge. And well over 100 companies, large and small, before we left, signed a pledge committing to ban the box voluntarily. And we also have cities and states that are looking at legislation as well, because we know if we don't provide people with a job, how are they going to take care of themselves? And that contributes, of course, to the recidivism, which brings me to my other major point on this, which is occupational licenses. Again, because of mounting evidence of the unintended consequences of licenses, the president directed his Council on Economic Advisors to examine how they're used and determine that although they do serve a very useful purpose, you want to make sure that people are trained for certain skills that they need, they have grown exponentially over the last several years. And now a quarter of all jobs in our country require a license. And far too many states and municipalities, primarily states, have laws that are blanketly prohibiting people who have been incarcerated from having that license. And so Loretta Lynch sent a letter to all 50 governors saying, take a look at your occupational licenses and decide if they're fair and reasonable. And if they're not, change them, because it's one more impediment to ensuring that people can have a job. My final point here is executive privilege. I mentioned pardons. I am proud to say that President Obama granted clemency to 1,927 people. This is a number that I never round up or down, and the reason why is because, as we know, behind every single one of them is a story. It's a family, it's a sacrifice, it's a sense of injustice. Several of the people who have been commuted, not just by him, but by other former presidents, were serving life sentences. And I had lunch with several of them, with the president, who were commuted by President Bush, President Clinton, and President Obama, and I listened to their stories. And when you hear their stories, you feel the same thing that the president said when he was at El Reno. You know, but by the grace of God go I. Young people do stupid things. They just do. And they do it for a whole variety of reasons. But if we are the society that I think we are, don't we owe it to make sure that everybody who has earned a second chance gets a second chance? So there is much more work left to do. We have to strengthen our families and invest in our young people to make sure that every child gets that fair shot. We have to fund and train indigent and defense lawyers to make sure that they are getting the resources and the training they need to do their higher calling. We need to pass meaningful legislation, not just at the federal, but at the state and local level, since the vast majority of the people who are incarcerated, of that 2.2 million, are at the state and local level. We need to educate the public, including the private sector, that reforms that remove the structural and cultural barriers to successful reentry will, in fact, make our community safer, and that we should all recognize our individual and our societal responsibility to give someone that second chance. Our competitive advantage here in the United States is our human capital. Let's not throw any of it away. So I know in this political climate, and I kind of joked a little bit about it earlier, but it's actually not funny. It's really not. It's terrifying. And I know that there are a lot of concerns about whether the reforms that we put in place together will stick, whether or not we will ensure that we have a Justice Department that steps up to its responsibilities. We want to make sure that the guidance that was given to federal prosecutors does not get retracted. We want to make sure that our Civil Rights Division takes their enforcement responsibilities seriously. We worry about whether or not the federal legislation will move forward, notwithstanding the fact that it enjoys bipartisan support. This is the only effort that I can think of where you have the ACLU and Koch Industries both together saying, we can do this together, we just need the will in Congress to move it forward. Will the evidence-based forensic medicine that we spent so much time and energy putting in place be focused upon, be funded, and be valued within the administration? These are all open questions, I know, but it's why I believe your work is more important than ever. I believe it is vital, and so I want us to recommit ourselves each and every day to provide our children and our grandchildren with that equitable and just society. And you're not alone. We're not going to stop. We're not going to back down. We're going to encourage people to get involved in local races. You should care who your DA is. You should care who your state's attorney is. And in fact, you should think about running for office yourself. And I met a young man here today who's going to run for office. Get in the arena. So let us pledge that we are going to continue our fight for a system that lives up to the promise of America's own founding, a promise that, simply put, liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much, everybody.